There's a fascinating comment I ran across to turn atheism another way by one of the central Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, is a man named Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. And Rabbi Kook was the first chief rabbi of Mandated Palestine. He was a fascinating figure. He was a mystic. He was a remarkable figure. And he wrote an essay called The Pangs of Cleansing. And in the essay, he writes that God's being, as conceived by the multitude and even by individuals who would be their leaders, is that of a ruthless power from whom there's no escape and to whom we must necessarily be subservient. The tendency to see the divine essence as embodied in words and in letters alone is a source of embarrassment to humanity. And atheism arises as a pained outcry to liberate man from this narrow and alien pit, to raise him from the darkness of focusing on letters and words alone, to place his primary focus on the realm of morals. So it seems like that for Rabbi Kook, he sees atheism as a way of keeping religion honest and critiquing it when it descends into this kind of numbing dogma and this coercive fundamentalism. And that, in turn, would suggest that we would be better off not to draw these sharp dichotomies between what we call religious and what we call secular. I wonder if you could both reflect on the relationship between so-called religious communities and so-called secular ones.
Yeah. I think there are lots of different kinds of atheists, but I would, in particular, distinguish two. One was nicely defined for me by the late Sir Isaiah Berlin, with whom I became quite close towards the end of his life. And the first time he came to our house, he said, "Chief Rabbi, whatever you do, don't talk to me about religion. When it comes to God, I'm tone deaf." And then he said, "What I don't understand is how you studied philosophy at Cambridge and Oxford. How is it that you believe?" And I said, "Sir Isaiah, if it helps, think of me as a lapsed heretic." Quite understand it, boy, quite understand. So there is the kind of atheist with whom I've had dialogues. I had a dialogue 2 weeks ago on the BBC, quite a long one, with Richard Dawkins. And that's how I understand Richard Dawkins. He's tone deaf to some of the wretched, not all. He has a sense of awe in the presence of nature, of the vastness of the universe. But in other respects, he's tone deaf. And he said, absolutely right, I am tone deaf, which was an interesting admission on his part. So they're the tone deaf atheists. And then there are the other kind of atheists who really have soul and who really see the failings of the embodiment of religion at any given moment. And I make it my principle to have open dialogue with those atheists, and I have them all the time in Britain and in Israel. I'm thinking here of real prophetic figures who are complete atheists, very anti-religious, like the Israeli novelists Amos Oz, David Grossman, Aleph Beit Yehoshua, with all of whom I have a close friendship. I'm thinking of interesting intellectuals with whom I've had dialogues like Steven Pinker, like George Steiner. And when you're in conversation with such people, you feel incredibly enlarged because, they are seeing things from a different perspective to you, and you come away with a sense of real having made space for the other, and that's important. And that conversation is so fundamental to Judaism. I don't know of any other civilization than Judaism, all of whose canonical texts are anthologies of arguments. And if they ain't got a decent argument, it ain't Jewish, And so, and the greatest figures in the Bible argue with God himself. Abraham does, Moses does, Jeremiah does, Job does, Jonah does. I mean, that's part of the dialectic of faith. And no one ever eliminates the argument. Even if the argument has been resolved in favor of Hillel over Shammai, we still repeat the teaching of Shammai. So I think there's an argument with atheists that enlarges us. I think it was those profoundly humanist atheists that Rav Kook was talking about.
Yeah. No, I mean, I entirely agree. We need atheists. We people of faith need atheists. analogous to the Shabbos Goy, so that the Jewish community needs. Yeah, no, but at a much more profound level, we need them as conversation partners. And they don't always realize that the reverse is also true. But sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. And then one has a really deep conversation.
Professor Taylor, I wanted to conclude our discussion by basically talking about how can certain people transcend the kind of thinking box they're in. How can they come to it? You know, you talked about tone deafness. Can we take a person who doesn't think in these terms and talk to them in a way where they can begin to think in these terms?
Well, I don't think, exactly talk them into it, because, as you say, I mean, Weber uses this expression too, religiös unmusikalisch, I'm religiously unmusical. The same, it's like the tone, I mean, it's very interesting. And Weber used it in a kind of semi-ironic way, because he was kind of both self-critical and also espousing that. Obviously, Dawkins was just espousing that. So that gives you a hint that if somebody's really tone deaf and you want to explain why Beethoven is great, you just can't do it, right? So something has to touch them, some sense of the limits of this, some sense of what can go beyond this, and that's very hard to program. I mean, I don't know, I think that people of faith, really remarkable people of faith, manage to touch people by what they are, much more than by any arguments that they can actually deploy. But it seems clear to me that lives lived simply within this very circumscribed box are somehow missing something. They're missing even an aspiration that goes beyond that box. And once people get a hint of this, then of course you can re-describe the situation. I mean, you were saying about, he was trying to explain community to this person, this British politician, and he didn't get what you were saying. I mean, that's a very arresting situation when you think it's very clear to me and let me articulate it, and you don't get it. But if they do begin to get it, or just if, the fact that you're saying that, and they have a certain sense that there's something deep in your life, and you're saying that, and they don't get it, well, I'm worried I don't get it. Let me try to see what it could be. That can open something, which can open a conversation.